You're listening to the Rogue Insider podcast.
But I want to know how groups of people manage to maintain peace. Because that's something that concerns me.
Yeah, it's a big question in the modern world. So I'm definitely keen. Listeners of this podcast who have read our write-up on Anchor will realise that one of the things that we're going to discuss is geopolitics, and I'm very keen to lay out our basic approach to geopolitics on this podcast, so that when we dive into deeper subjects, our listeners will have a strong background against which to consider our notions.
Right. Well, geopolitics is essentially referring to the larger states, right?
Yeah, it's state strategy, which takes seriously geography. So the geostrategist's concern is geopolitics.
Geostrategist being, okay, there's a big ocean over there, and it's going to be a pain in the ass for somebody to invade us across an ocean. So we'll use that as a natural boundary, which tends to incline us towards internal issues and facing the other direction, something like that.
Yeah, that's right. Geographic features make up a major part of the way that geostrategists think about why states come to prominence and how they achieve the power that they do. So a classic example is Sir Halford Mackinder, who is a very early thinker on these issues, and he put forward the hypothesis that Eurasia is a world island, and that whoever manages to control all of the world island sets themselves up with a foothold to be able to control the rest of the world. So no state that seeks to have a dominant position in the world can do without considering how to dominate the majority, or preferably the entirety of Eurasia. And we can see how this approach has fed into considerations in the strategic decisions made by powerful states throughout history from Mackinder's time. So we can
Isn't this also counterbalanced by a theory of oceans? If you control the oceans, you control the trade. And what was the date of that world island thesis?
Well, to give you Halford's dates, he was born in 1861 and died in 1947.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so
he's talking about, okay, it's relatively recent then.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's call it turn of the century.
Recent.
Yeah.
Right.
So if we look at the United Kingdom's approach to Europe, the UK's fundamental approach to geostrategy is to say, if we keep Europe divided against other European powers, then they'll never be able to unify enough to get off Europe, and therefore never be able to launch into the ocean, and therefore never really challenge us. And that allows the UK to put all of their military resources into the Navy, therefore fortifying their position. So occasionally they'll send troops across to Europe just to kind of help one side or another, whichever one's the losing side, just kind of bolster them. That same approach can be said of the United States and the world island. So the driving principle of the Cold War, from the geostrategist's perspective, is not the ideological clash between the free world and communism. The problem was that a single political entity, the USSR, had covered all of Russia and half of Europe, and keep in mind that China was communist at this stage, if those bonds of communism had forged a political entity between the USSR and China, then that would have covered 2/3 of Eurasia. at which point, if it was able to keep itself together as a single unified political force, it would have easily have swept, all of the rest of the Asian states, all of the rest of Europe, and then it would have been, quite simple to knock over India, and then they would have bolted down control of the world island, at which point the United States would have had not just a peer competitor, but a competitor that they had no real way of confronting. So, naturally, they took over or allied with Western Europe, using the NATO pact against the NATO treaty against the Warsaw Pact, and then Kissinger very cleverly brought China on side against the Russians, because unknown to the Americans at that point, Russia-China relations were actually surprisingly poor.
Well, then this is leading into the Vietnam War as well, right? The competition for the extension of the communist state down through Southeast Asia.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or the communist influence, the ideology.
Yeah, they were domino theory. The idea that if China takes Vietnam, because Vietnam was regarded as a proxy war, then it would have been fairly simple for them to knock over all of the Southeast Asian states and turn them into communist countries as well.
And this is obviously not declared. This is not how states operate. They don't say, "Oh, we're concerned about the world island, so we're going to get involved and sort of clamp down on the freedom of other nations to decide their own fates."
Well, it's hard to know what states think, because states are large bureaucracies of people with clashing opinions. But geostrategists approach things from this perspective, and geostrategists are nested inside the foreign policy departments of states. And generally speaking, the larger and more abstract the strategic considerations, the closer they are to the central analysis of foreign policy departments. So perhaps I'm flattering the geostrategists by saying this, but I would think that it makes sense for states to anchor their geostrategists in the centre of their foreign policy, and the way that they go out and approach the world. And once we have an understanding of what the internal imperatives of a state are, we can very quickly place those imperatives inside the environment that they're in, and those imperatives are partly formed by that environment, and then that will give us a way of understanding how those states approach their relationship with other states in the world.
Now, I've heard another argument, as I was trying to mention before, which was, in addition to the concept of the world island, there is also the notion of controlling the three seas.
Well,
but obviously that requires naval activity as opposed to an island unity, which is, well, exclusively land-based.
That's right. Because geostrategy, as we think of it as a discipline, comes out of Europe, it's primarily formed by the experience of the pre-war European powers. If you think about all of the little cabinet wars that were going on, during the Napoleonic era and prior to that and immediately after, these states manoeuvring against each other in these close conditions, and you have this Northern European playing with which is hard to defend, so armies can move back and forth across them. That gives us our perspective for or sort of a history of perspectives about the way that states operate against each other. However, also geostrategy is, as it's currently practiced, is very much an American phenomenon, which inherits its approach very much from the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom's approach is naval, as we've previously discussed, and because the world is majority ocean, whoever has the dominant naval force, it gives them an option. So any time, if you have a dominant naval force, you can choose to land your marines somewhere if you want to, and if you don't want to, you don't have to. Whereas if you are the second naval power everything you do is entirely predicated on whether or not you can get away with it, because at any point moving on the ocean you might be interdicted by a superior power and have everything sunk. So the might of the British Empire was almost entirely founded upon the strength of the British Navy, and in exactly the same manner, the might of the United States is predicated entirely on the strength of the US Navy and Air Force and Marines and Army. So we shouldn't be surprised then that the United States, as the sort of single hyperpower of the world, invests so heavily and so massively in its naval power, to such a degree that the US Navy could handily wipe out the combined navies of the rest of the world. And also keep in mind that the largest air force in the world is the US Air Force, and the second largest air force in the world is the US Navy.
Oh, what about, is this not undermined by new advents and new technologies, or is essentially America's leading that as well? Because you have this trump card, excuse the pun, but I mean, in space, you got spaceport, you've got satellites, you've got technology that relies on relaying communications.
Yeah, so there is such a thing as the technological offset strategy. During the Cold War, the United States performed a technological offset strategy, which is just to say that in the early parts of the Cold War, the United States didn't feel that it had the ability to fight the Russian army on land and win due to the mass of the Russian land forces. So in addition to pursuing the diplomatic task of building an alliance against them and moving towards containment, they also attempted to always be one generation of technology ahead, so that even in places where there was evenly matched forces, theoretically you should always be coming out on top. The third offset strategy being pursued currently is attempting to do the same thing, just making sure that there's always a technological advantage in every engagement, which often means that you don't ever need to engage because you can just cluster your forces somewhere and the ground is ceded. Now, obviously the second power of the world at this moment is China, and China's going to come up a fair amount in this conversation, I would think. So one of the downsides of technological speculation is that we can never actually be certain to what degree technology is going to make a difference in warfare until it's tested. A classic example of this is the battleships. Prior to the Second World War, battleships were regarded as the foremost technological achievement and the kind of central playing piece of naval combat. During the Second World War, it became obvious that actually the carrier and using air power was going to be the new way forward, so all of the battleships were made redundant and everybody invested in carriers. And that was based off the sinking of the Bismarck.
Right, that giant one, the real world test.
Yeah, exactly. That immense battleship that the Germans launched, which in the end was taken out by a torpedo that got a lucky hit on one of its rear propellers from a First World biplane. And it just became obvious at that point that air power was where it was at. And if anyone who's interested in carrier-on-carrier combat, I recommend looking into the American and Japanese conflicts in the Pacific Theatre. It will give you a really good idea of how sea and air power combine and how that worked out. So it's difficult to say without that evidence what the technological relationship is between the US and China, and the reason why I'm using those two examples is because they're the first and second powers in the world. until they've been tested, which is not something I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, although I feel like I'm full of conjecture and suppositions and estimations and black swans. I don't
Yeah.
know what's hidden. There's all sorts of stuff. And then I've got this other prospect of if that stuff isn't hidden and if it is all revealed the way it is and there is a communications wipeout, how easily does a carrier group operate as its own communications station? And it flies around, it's spotter planes, and it has its boats all spread out. I mean, probably they're trained for that.
You would like to think so, but a lot of according to popular rumour, the officer class in the Navy at the moment, or at least in the young officers, no longer has the skills of the pre-internet era that were required. I've no idea whether that's true or not, but I've heard people say it. And the problem is, of course, is maybe, given that missile technology is so good, maybe carriers are obsolete. Maybe the fact that the US has a naval fleet of carriers that can take out the rest of the world's navy just doesn't matter anymore, because you can hit each one of them with a massive swarm of extremely fast and extremely manoeuvrable missiles, such that no amount of missile defence will be able to prevent them being destroyed, even at immense ranges.
Oh, terrifying. Okay.
And
well, in that
even
scenario,
worse,
oh god, yep.
Even worse, think about the importance of network security in the modern era. When all of your communications are being done across the internet, or at the very least across an internet,
yeah,
and satellites are just sitting ducks and they can all be taken out, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to the F-35 when it loses all network security? So,
well, you'd hope that they could operate on their own, and then they'll, I don't know, fly around and look for things without any satellite assistance. Good lord.
Yeah, they're an integrated fighter, right? So they're supposed to operate inside a whole envelope of other technologies as part of a combined arms effort. So, as a single unit, forget about it. So you absolutely have to have a space command and a cyber command, which is why the United States very recently instituted a cyber command and a space command. So in quote unquote the next war, how will the technological breakdown of each of the forces and which armies and navies and air forces, what they bring to the fight, how can we predict what the outcome of those battles will be? I can't do that, and I hesitate even to bring it up.
Well, I would hope that there would be political maneuverings that would accommodate for this, that would allow for the minimization of the prospect of hot conflict.
And this is the second part of geostrategy, right? Geopolitics. So we move from just raw questions of military might into, okay, now that we have these questions of military might, and that kind of sets the table for us, then how do states go about maneuvering diplomatically with each other? We saw the creation of the Warsaw Pact and the NATO Treaty in the Cold War. And recent suggestions, in fact, Pompeo's speech recently put forward, more strongly the idea that even if there can't be a quote-unquote Asian NATO, still there can be some variety of alliance that can't contain but can at least counterbalance Chinese aggression. And that's showing itself in terms of there's going to be an exercise later this year or next year, a naval exercise, in which the US, Japan, India, and Australia are all going to cooperate on sea. And it's pretty clear who those exercises are pointed at.
Isn't Japan fielding one of the largest, most advanced navies?
I'm pretty sure the naval power of Japan is significant.
Right. Okay. So, geopolitical maneuverings, the alliance between states that share regional um, interest.
Yep, overlapping concerns. So it's obvious that in geopolitics, alliances are never held on the basis of honour, right? No state ever says to itself, look, we agreed to this thing, whatever it is that is in this treaty, and it doesn't serve our interests right now, but we said we would do it, so we're going to. That never occurs. It's only ever the treaties are only ever the formal recognition of the fact that overlapping interests exist. So one of the key theorists in geopolitics at the moment is John J. Mearsheimer, and his approach is called offensive realism. And listeners to our former podcast will have heard me mention him before. And his argument is quite straightforward, that because there is no central authority in the world to resolve disputes, and because every state has some level of military capacity, and because intentions are unverifiable, then that puts states in a position where they have to be concerned for, first and foremost, for their own survival, and therefore they need to invest in militaries, and so the story goes, those investments set off mutual escalations of capacities between countries that are nervous about each other. Consequently, Mearsheimer, of course, called his book The Tragedy of Great Power Politics.
No, but what is the great tragedy?
The tragedy is that states are almost inevitably destined to come into conflict with each other.
Well, in which case, efforts are going to be put in to mitigate that, or efforts are going to be put in to maybe leverage that if it's in your interest. Okay, so lensing it in that regard, we're looking at hot zones or flashpoints around the country.
Mm-hmm.
Was it? It's a few people have come across. George Friedman focuses primarily on Europe.
Yep.
Peter Zayan seems to focus on three major flashpoints. He's talking about the Southeast Asia. He's talking about the Middle East, Iran, Saudi, and he's talking about the steppes. What are they called? Those plains across Ukraine between Germany and Russia?
Yeah, just the steppe.
Oh, the steppe, okay.
Yep.
There's the three main significant global issue flashpoints. I mean, there'll be other small things around the planet. And the reason this is an issue now is because of the collapse of the global order.
Yeah, that's right. So I did recently read Zion's latest book, Disunited Nations, which is excellent. It's interesting that his approach doesn't seem to be shared, or at least I was not aware when I was studying it, that geopolitical theory doesn't seem to really resonate around Zion's analysis very much, which I don't understand, because when I read it, I found it extremely eye-opening. Yeah, and his basic perspective is that now that the threat of the USSR has disappeared, there's really no reason for the United States to be involved in the world until another peer competitor comes along. Now, anyone who reads the news will say, well, excuse me, what about China? They're a peer competitor to the United States. And I would agree that they're definitely the closest peer competitor to the United States. However, Zion is extremely dismissive of China as a power. In fact, his question is not, in 10 years will China challenge the United States? His question is more along the lines of, in 10 years will there even be a China?
That's right. It's the same thing I came across. I was surprised because his posits were not echoed in the other sources I was looking into.
No,
They're all hailing China as a significant threat because it has the manufacturing base and because of the innovative catalytic potential of their Shenzhen industrial center.
yeah. And look at the Chongqing Chengdu complex in the backcountry, massive industrial centres. Look, he's a unique voice, and I think that his reasoning is sound, and I don't know why he's not taken more seriously.
He's focusing a lot on independent energy production. He's very straightforward in his assessment of the modern world's dependence on fossil fuels
Yep.
and that how that influence has played a major role in shaping global activities.
Mm-hmm.
And he sees the shale revolution in the US, albeit on the decline again now, thanks to the ridiculous price competition that's going on to try and keep the wells alive in Saudi and Russia.
Yep.
He's saying that the restoration of those wells could be achieved in, he's saying, 6 weeks, in which case the US, in the state of a global conflict or supply chain degradation, the competition between other nations for oil supply will create a mess that everyone's going to have to deal with and will weaken all states. Well, not as in United States, but as in nations worldwide, whereas the US, it will be secure in its own supply chain.
Absolutely. In fact, the United States lifted the restrictions on the export of domestically produced hydrocarbons for the first time, whenever it was, just a few years ago.
So they're finally overproducing.
Yes. Yeah, the US has been a net producer of hydrocarbons for a while. Whereas, compare that to China's position. China's domestic hydrocarbon production is essentially coal. Now, Zion's reasoning is to try and bring oil in from the Middle East, past India, a country that is currently in a nuclear standoff with China, through the Malacca Strait and through the South China Sea, past Vietnam, who has fought something like 20-something wars with China in its history, and has a powerful submarine force.
And a growing industry base.
Yep, into China in order to fuel its industry, which also, keep in mind, could be interdicted by a Japanese navy if they wanted to.
Well, it's the same
basically
naval path, isn't it? It's the same road.
Yeah.
Naval road. Is that what they call them now? Naval roads, which is a bit weird.
Well, it is weird.
Lanes.
The Belt and Road Initiative, the road is on the ocean and the belt is on the land. But anyway, distraction. So yeah, theoretically they could bring it in overland, right? But the Russians are not going to pay for that investment. So then is China going to pay to have the pipelines built to bring them the oil? Maybe, but then even oil pipelines then are not that secure. And what else could they do? Theoretically, they could try and send an oil pipeline through Pakistan, or through Afghanistan. But we know how Afghanistanis are about oil pipelines.
No way. There's no way your pipe's going to be safe running through mountain regions. You can't protect that.
And even if you do that, what's India going to do? India has an air force. How hard is it to blow up an oil pipeline? Very simple. So, you see this. So Zion's argument is that from a hydrocarbon perspective, the United States is sitting pretty, and China is royally screwed. Let me pick up a similar point. I recently also read Luttwak's book, The Rise of China versus the Logic of Strategy. And in that, he makes an argument which is diplomatic, which is simply that as China grows, its growth itself will threaten its neighbours, and its neighbours will start to band together to what in geostrategic terms is called balancing, and they will start to form balancing coalitions against Chinese efforts to move outwards. Now, theoretically, China ought to be able to pick off those by pick off those countries by making those countries dependent in economic terms on China's growth and integrating them into their supply chains. But Look Back points out that, generally speaking, the Chinese practice of diplomacy has relied on self-defeating clever tricks that there's never really had the kind of long-term perspective that true IR diplomatic solutions are based on. And also we should point out that communist countries have very poor soft power as well. So, the combination of these factors make it unlikely that China will be able to bring small countries on side, which is probably the reason why their only friends in all the world are North Korea, Pakistan and Myanmar.
Well, they are inherently intimidating simply because they are ethno-nationalist.
Yeah. And their proclivity for culturally exterminating their internal foes
Good Lord.
probably makes other countries around them nervous. And aside from the fact, let alone the fact that the Chinese have never had the opportunity to punish Japan for that time that Japanese killed 15 million civilians inside China. Oof. So, that kind of blood legacy is still present.
Not easily forgotten. Okay, so who was it that wrote The Destined for War?
It was
an author we haven't mentioned.
Graham Allison.
Graham Allison, right. And so Graham Allison is talking about the trajectory in terms of the continued growth of industrial might and the inevitability of the confrontation. Now, he isn't explicitly factoring in any significant alliance effort to slow down or to cripple or to hinder that rise. He struck me in his writings as suggesting it was inevitable.
Yeah. So Graham Allison is the one who is responsible for the popularization of the idea of the Thucydides trap, which I don't think we need to explain what that is to our audience.
It's everywhere at the moment, but
okay.
I mean, a 2-sentence summary doesn't hurt.
Thucydides trap is just the idea that a rising power and a hegemonic power automatically come into conflict. It's pretty straightforward. Yeah, so Graham Allison's argument is that China's rise, assuming that it does continue to rise, will almost inevitably lead to a conflict at some point with the United States.
Right. Well, I'm spiraling off in thoughts as to how China can maintain its momentum. And certainly by having so many nations dependent on it for trade, keeps its industry turning over to some degree. But there must be large swaths that are now suffering a crippling blow from industry being moved overseas, like with Japan's efforts with, was it Mitsubishi and Toyota or whatever they're manufacturing plants, and then all those other corporations, a whole slew of them, something like 85 of them already moving to India.
Yeah. And because their successes led to the rise in wages, then a lot of companies are already economically interested in shifting to somewhere else. All of the industries that China built its wealth off in its second phase of growth, all of those have now been shipped to other places. Why would you put together textiles in China when you can do it in Vietnam?
This is because the conditions for labour are so much poorer and the financial demands are lower. So it's economically in your interest, not in a humanitarian sense.
No, absolutely not. In fact, the only way that China is able to continue to compete in textiles is by employing slave labour. Because keep in mind that it has recently been revealed that the majority of the world's clothes producers are actually dependent on Chinese slave labour, at least at some point in their manufacturing chain.
I have seen that, and then new laws being passed in the developed world. Was it America leading the way there, passing laws against
yes, this is one of those happy moments when morality and geostrategy combine.
Nice. I feel for the plight of the Chinese people. I don't think that's a very nice condition over there. I've grown up for so long. In my life, I was taking for granted the liberties that I get to enjoy, and I saw, slavish conditions in other parts of the world, and I didn't envy them, obviously, and I didn't really understand exactly what it was that makes those conditions. And having seen how the boot of authoritarianism operates, thanks to the internet, essentially,
Yeah.
I can really see it's intolerable.
I cannot tell you how absolutely grateful I am to live in the free world. It is phenomenal. The idea of somehow being integrated into the technologically assisted AI digital fascism, it just, oh God, it makes my whole body just quiver with revulsion. I really pray that the Chinese people manage to find their way out from underneath the heel of the Communist Party at some point.
In what way does the current geopolitical climate affect you as an individual?
Well, there's two answers to that question, and they're at opposite ends of the spectrum. One of them is none at all, because geopolitics operates at a time span that is so slow it's almost imperceptible from the human perspective, and so large that it's almost invisible, right? But on the other hand, since the age of states arose, all of history has been driven essentially by either state competition or technological development. And a lot of technological development arose from state competition. So the modern world is entirely built out of geopolitics. George Friedman makes an excellent example about exactly how much of all the technology that we rely on was developed purely for the purposes of, military applications.
By not standing against the immoral actions of other nations and allowing our own industries to profit from them, it shows that there really is a cost. There is a real cost to it. We have assisted the rise of a nation whose values do not match our own in the free world.
Yeah. Unfortunately,
cheap goods were costly.
I hear you, but what the concomitant argument there is, well, what was the alternative? Should the United States not have engaged with China and just acted to permanently keep China poor forever? I mean, China dragged 1 billion people out of poverty over the 20th century, well, second half of the 20th century, admittedly paid for largely by the United States and operating within an economic system that was entirely funded and protected by the United States.
And this is in the hopes that they would adapt to a democratic system.
Yeah, well, in one of the largest and most ridiculous failures of geopolitical analysis, many people believed, including me, in the early 21st century, that wealth, opportunity, openness would inevitably lead China to the overthrow of the Communist Party. However, because the Communist Party has eyes and saw what happened to Russia after the fall of the USSR from 89 to 91, a large portion of the development of the Communist Party has been based specifically around preventing that from happening. And the idea that US strategists didn't see that their hopes would be counteracted and that they needed a counter strategy against that counteraction is mind-blowing to me.
Well, vested interest in the status quo.
A whole combination
was...
of factors, and that one was definitely present.
That disappointing.
And greed, right? Just turn a blind eye and get wealthy.
Greed, right.
Yep.
So what was the turning point? What was the event?
I don't know if we can pin a single event on the realization that the Communist Party was becoming an actual threat to the United States. Politically speaking, you could say that the removal of term limits for Xi Jinping from the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party is probably a good indicator. But realistically...
militarily, the capture and replication of advanced fighter jets?
Yeah, just to
stealth jet?
The absolute ravaging of the American economy by Chinese economic spies, which, by the way, was recently called by a high-level member of the US military the greatest transfer of wealth in history, to give you an idea of the amount of scale that is going on.
That's the IP stolen, right?
Yep, that's right. In fact, there's a whole number of quotes that could fit in here. I read Fred Kaplan's book Dark Territory, where he talked about IP theft, and there's great quotes, stuff like every time we look for signs of like cyber breaking and entering, we always find it. And another one would be something along the lines of, almost always, if a person thinks that their company hasn't been breached, what's actually happened is that they haven't looked for breaches. The level of penetration is incredible. Another great book about this was Silent Invasion by Clive Hamilton, where he documents the level of subversion in Australia by Chinese operatives. Now, we're talking about it in purely economic terms, but Clive Hamilton goes into not just the economy, but universities, media, politics, the civil society, across the whole spectrum. The level of penetration by Communist Party operatives in the Australian system is disgusting. It's to the degree that I don't know how they're going to be able to operate in such a way to push them out. Because as we've seen, Australia and China are increasingly at each other's throats. Partly,
this is right. They're at each other's throats while Australia General is engaged in 50% trade. The GDP is 50% trade with China, and on the west coast it's 80%.
Yeah, and look, no surprise that Australia is not eager to upset the relationship with China, seeing as off the back of Chinese growth is what has kept Australia free of any economic downturn over the last 25 years. But the fact is, they're digging up everything in the backcountry to feed it to China, and the Communist Party is using those profits and resources to dig into and destroy Australian society across every part of it. So
there does seem to be kickback against that now. I mean, certainly in the rhetoric on the national level, I've noticed a lot of kickback against China, but how strong that can be. I mean, naval exercises with the US is one thing, but disengaging your prime industries, 50% of your GDP and 80% on the West, I mean, who owns the companies? I believe we looked into that, and you said they were actually American-owned mining companies.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. So I imagine that a fair amount of the Australian economy can be diversified at the top end to America and at the bottom end to India. But there's no getting around the fact that if Australia wants to separate itself economically from China, it will lead to a massive decline in Australia's economic position as it stands right now.
Prosperity index plummet
Yeah.
temporarily, maybe.
But as Mearsheimer said when he was in Australia, given the choice between security and wealth, states choose security. Because, again, what's the alternative? A lot of Australians are still telling themselves that they can run this middle course where they can sort of do all of the trading with China that they want to and keep all of the political advantages of being aligned to the United States. And anyone who thinks that is fooling themselves. If Australia chooses the path of economic integration with China and starts sacrificing their political relationship with the United States, they will become an enemy of the United States. And we've seen what happens to enemies of the United States.
Well, not to mention, it's one thing to have your prime industries exporting to a nation as your central trade partner. It's another to have those prime industries owned by another country.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really untenable position.
Central. Yeah, that's... Well, there's only one option then. I don't know if the public know it, but the one option seems to be pretty clearly you're with the US, and that's why the naval fleets are over there. In fact, what's the other booming business in Australia? That's the shipbuilding.
That's right. Austal is the name of one of the major companies in Australia at the moment that is producing some incredible percentage of the aluminium-hulled ships.
Set to have, was it by the end of the contract, it will have been responsible for constructing 25%.
Was it 25%?
Yeah, by the end of the contract.
Incredible. So, yeah, realistically...
And they're drone boats, basically, high-speed drone boats.
Yeah.
Aluminium.
Which is clearly the right strategy, right? In a highly technological era, you don't centralize your power sources. Instead, you diversify them all and then set them off against each other. Yeah, so... Yeah, I think that if anyone thinks that continued Chinese-Australian economic integration is on the cards, they're fooling themselves. I just don't see how it can come out any other way.
Well, this is where you might have to reveal something to our New Zealand listeners, and that is that New Zealand and Australia as a relationship is quite unique in the world, you've said before?
Yeah, it's the closest economic relationship between any two countries in the world.
And what would that mean?
Well, that essentially means that New Zealand does everything that Australia does. Aside from that, like, from a geostrategic perspective, New Zealand is extremely blessed in the sense that it's a long way away from everything, except for Australia, and Australia shares a culture and language and history with New Zealand, and our other former ally, now very, very, very good friend, the United States, controls the oceans. So it's a blessed position. The downside is do what your allies tell you.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not like we've got any might to flex
exactly
in any direction at all. Maybe
That's
some
right.
crack troops that send as an assisting role in some war in some godforsaken place.
That's right. I mean, we do have some assets. Our SAS is respected. Our PA Orion spy planes are, excellent for what they do. We do have some naval power. But
and we're a good spot for relay communication stations to the satellite networks.
Yeah.
We're part of the Five Eyes network.
Exactly
and I think
right.
It's pretty obvious we should be operating in accordance with our Five Eyes partners' demands.
Of course.
Given that we are so small. But I have heard conflicting reports, was it several years ago now, when Trump was in and he sent round that one of his generals and they came to New Zealand and asked our Prime Minister why all the intel they were supplying to New Zealand as part of Five Eyes was getting fed to China, and our Prime Minister responded, "No, it isn't," which is not a very good bargaining strategy. If that's really the case, and we are actually, how would you say, penetrated to such a degree, equivalent to Australia, I'd say, and it's certainly in terms of primary trading partner, it's China again. Who gets most of our milk products? It's China.
Yeah. Well,
So we can diversify those. I mean, other countries are going to want them, so we can shift as well. But currently, we don't want to wake the dragon either.
well, they say there's this old saying that there's no such thing as an ex-CIA person. That anyone who has been employed by the CIA is now always a part of the CIA. I think you could say something similar about the CCP. And we have quote-unquote former members of the Chinese Communist Party in our parliament right now.
Good Lord. Which parties?
Both.
Okay, well, that's a bit of a gesture.
Oh, it's revolting. They should all be fired, obviously. But, neither of them, one of them wants to do it first, because that will mean admitting that, that's what's going on. And so then the other one can be like, oh, well, the other guys ought to. It's ridiculous.
Well, we're so small and so compromised that we'd best just shut up and see what happens
Exactly.
at this point.
Yeah.
Okay.
But if we get kicked out of the Five Eyes network, forget about it. And that's the threat that is on the table. The United States has said to New Zealand that if we don't pull our socks up, we will get kicked out of the Five Eyes network. In fact, when Britain was considering the Huawei contract for the 5G outlay, the Americans told them, if you let Huawei build your 5G network, we'll consider kicking you out of the Five Eyes network.
Well, they've since reneged on that, which is good.
Yeah,
Has New Zealand reneged on our Huawei integration?
I bloody hope so.
That's something to look into then.
All right, what else do we need to cover? Is there anything else that needs to go into a basic overview of our geopolitical approach?
Okay. We have, as part of Zayan's view, he talks about climate and food productivity, food scarcity, and the rising nations. He lists Argentina as a standout state. He says obviously they have corruption issues, but the nature of the landscape with the mountains and the forests and the ocean all around them and their productive valleys sets them up to be able to rise out of any global crisis to become at least a significant player.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's definitely some geography in there. Now, the other nations he mentions as critical points of concern, he's looking at... what were the other ones?
Well, Zion's saying is that the best type of country is crunchy on the outside and gooey in the middle, right? You want some kind of defence, whether it's distance or big oceans like a moat or large mountain ranges, so that you can easily defend your country. And then on the inside of the country, you want, a large and vibrant agricultural sector, preferably overlaid with a network of transportable rivers to make transportation cheap. All of those things are things that the United States absolutely excels on. Therefore, Zion says, yes, well, must be the reason why the United States is the superpower of the world. And Argentina has these things. It's far enough away from its neighbours that it's not super concerned about being invaded or anything like that. And it has a significant agricultural internal network. And, you could say something similar about New Zealand as well, I suppose. He's fairly positive about New Zealand. Although, interestingly, he also rates France quite highly. For a whole variety of factors.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. France, because it has a little bit of everything, but also a navy that can go to its colonies to secure something that might be missing.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Well, if that covers geopolitics, we should look into internal sources of instability in the next one.
Okay, sounds good.
Right. Till
Nice
then.
one. Good, good. You've been listening to the Rogue Insider podcast. Stay tuned, there's plenty more on the way.